My name is Danielle, and I'm a reference librarian here at the library. We are very pleased to co-sponsor this event with the Guilford Conservation Commission. At this time, I'm going to turn the mic over to Laura Collins, Chair of the Guilford Conservation Commission, and she will introduce tonight's featured speaker. After the presentation, we will have time to entertain some questions as well. So welcome, Laura.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad so many people turned out tonight. So as Danielle said, I'm chair of the Conservation Commission for the town of Guilford. And first I want to thank the library. You always are so hospitable as hosts to our programs, and we're also getting the word out, so thank you very much. The Guilford Conservation Commission is a town body that represents and takes care, oversees the town, the open space areas of the town, and I would say if anyone has an interest in, if you like to go out for walks in the woods, if you like to cut limbs off trees, if you like to move things that have fallen on top of our hiking trails. We have a great group of volunteers. That's the Land Stewardship Committee, and it's under one of our commissioners, Doug Clark. And if you have any interest in just additional information about the Conservation Commission, or if you want to get out on the trails and be part of this small, hardy group of people who keep them open and safe, there's a sheet of paper over there. Just sign up, give us your name and email address and phone number, and we'll follow up with you for sure. And so now I have the opportunity to introduce Spencer Meyer, Dr. Spencer Meyer, and he is a senior conservationist at Highstead, a regional conservation organization based in Reading, Connecticut. I grew up in that area, actually, New Fairfield. Spencer leads Highstead's conservation science and finance programs and works with partners throughout New England to develop new approaches to conservation. He's a co-author of the Wildlands and Woodlands report and an associate at the Harvard Forest. Previously, Spencer worked at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and as a fellow with the Global Science team at the Nature Conservancy, and for over a decade in Maine with academic, forest, industry, and conservation partners. He holds a degree from Dartmouth College and the University of Maine. He's also director of the Guilford Land Conservation Trust. He will introduce the Woodlands and Wetlands report, which provides a vision for the future of New England, and he'll discuss how Guilford is a part of that vision. He will share lessons from successful conservation collaboratives around New England and talk about research showing that protected open space is not only critical to preserving critical ecosystems, but also provides health, climate, and economic benefits to our communities. There will be ample time to discuss Guilford's cherished landscape and how it fits into the larger connected landscape. So, Spencer, thank you very much for coming.
First, I want to say thank you to the library and the Guilford Conservation Commission for inviting me to be here. It's really a lot of fun to come and talk about some of this work in my own hometown here, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But I'm a big fan of the town's open spaces. I spent a lot of time there, as you'll see from some of our pictures with my family. And we spend a lot of time here at the library. In fact, when I got here about a half an hour ago, my wife and boys were hanging out in the library coincidentally. Not to come hear me speak, but to come and do what you do in a library the rest of the time. So we're avid users of all these resources. So thank you very much to the Commission and the library for having me here. I'm also glad to see some friends in the audience and some new faces and some old friends. So thank you all for being here. I get a chance to talk in communities around New England, very rural communities and some suburban communities and some urban communities about different aspects of the work we do. And doing that in a different way in the town in which you live is really great fun to do. And you'll see I tried to include some of what everyone is doing here in town, both the Guilford Conservation Commission, but also the Guilford Land Conservation Trust. And so I should say in full disclosure that I'm here talking with you about my day job, but I'm also the newly elected vice president of the Guilford Land Conservation Trust. And so while I'm not speaking for the trust tonight, I do see a couple of fellow board members here. I undoubtedly will confuse my roles a little bit and talk a little bit about both of those things.
We're all headed in the same direction.
Yeah, I could not have said it better myself. Thank you. We're all trying to accomplish the same thing, and I think that'll be a theme of what we're going to talk about tonight. Who's familiar with the term "not in my backyard," NIMBY? Right, that's like a common frame. And so what I want us all to think about as we go through some slides and some conversation tonight is not what we don't want in our backyard, but what do we want in our backyard? What is it we are trying to accomplish? What is it we want our community to look like? And I should also say that in some towns and some places where I talk with folks about this, they've got a long way to go. But we're all fortunate to live in a town that is already doing a lot of these things really, really well. I think we are all very fortunate. Some people know that, some people don't yet know how fortunate we are to have a town that has been working so hard for decades to create and protect the environment around us. So some of what you're going to hear me advocate for are things that you are all already doing. I should also say this is not an ecology talk. I am an ecologist, I'm also a forester, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about plants and animals tonight. I'm going to make the assumption that you all understand one of the many reasons that we conserve land and protect land is for the critters and for the rare, threatened, endangered species, plants and animals and all those things. That is a critical underlying reason that we're concerned with the landscape around us and conserving it. But I'm going to talk to you about a lot of the other reasons we do that. And it'll become clear at some point why I do that. So even though I'm not going to talk about a lot of plants and animals, I want you to remember that is under the underpinning of a lot of what we're talking about. These are the kinds of critters I'm going to talk about, though. I'm going to talk about us, people, and some young ones and some old ones. And this is one of my sons, and this is on one of the great wilderness areas in the Northeast. This is right near the summit of Katahdin in Baxter State Park in Maine. This is Thoreau Springs right here. This is the highest point that Henry David Thoreau attained when he tried to climb Katahdin way back in the middle of the 19th century. And this is a sort of special place for us and for many other people. So as we talk about conserving the land around us, I want you to keep in mind these last great wilderness areas that are so important. But I also want us to be thinking about the places closer to home, the places where our kids are likely to run into each other. We were out at a family picnic one evening and ran into some of the boys' friends from school who also happen to be frolicking in the cord grass, Chaffinch Island here. And so we're not just talking about these faraway places you get to once a year if you're really lucky. We're talking about these places that you might recreate and enjoy with your family and friends on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. And to the environmental education component of this, this is the school garden that some of our families have been involved in, and thinking about how you learn about where our food comes from. So it's not just about enjoying wild places, but it's about understanding our own reliance on the world around us. And so then I want to peel back for a minute and think about our forests here in Guilford and the surrounding landscape in the context of North America and indeed the globe. Our forests here are critically important locally, as we're going to keep talking about, as you all already know, but they're important regionally, as this outline shows of the New England forest, but also continentally, because we have the most heavily, the densest region of forest in eastern North America and largely across the continent. So this is very important. The forest that we're conserving here in Guilford and surrounding communities is really part of a much bigger connected landscape. And indeed, on a global scale, we are part of the global carbon cycle, which we all know is so important for mitigating and reducing impacts from climate change. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And so this framing is the underpinnings for the Wildlands and Woodlands report, which is actually a series of reports, the latest version of which I have some full copies of over there on the table, and I also have some abbreviated versions of it. It's essentially a vision for the forests of New England that a group of about 30 authors from around New England, some academics and some conservation practitioners, myself included and many of my colleagues have written. And the leading organizations are the Harvard Forest, which is a research lab in central Massachusetts that is part of Harvard University, Highstead Foundation, which I'm going to say more about in a minute, where I spend most of my time, and the New England Forestry Foundation, one of my close partners. So Highstead, yes, we're based in Reading, and we are a regional conservation organization, but we're not a normal nonprofit, and we're not a land trust, and we don't do land transactions ourselves, but we're an operating foundation. So we're a self-endowed organization, The originating family actually has roots in Guilford from a couple of generations ago, so that's a kind of fun, interesting twist that we talk about sometimes. And it's an organization that's really committed to helping the partners around the region that are doing the work. So we work with lots of land trusts, we work with local and state and sometimes federal government agencies, we work with private businesses, we work with water utilities, we work with individual foundations and philanthropists, and this is all about building capacity to do more of the kind of work that you're doing here in Guilford throughout the region. So many of you are probably familiar with New England's long history, but I just want to center us there, make sure we all understand and remember that this was a heavily forested region that was largely cleared for agriculture through the mid-19th century. And then starting around the 1850s to the 1880s, as people tended to move west looking for more fertile ground for agriculture, our forests began to grow back. So we had this hugely depleted landscape without trees on the vast majority of it until people left the region, or many people left the region, and our forests came back. And so just a few years ago, we had about as much forest as we'd had in several centuries. But in the last decade or so, we're beginning to see that trend reverse itself again. And if you can see on the graph, each of the individual 6 states, the blue line is the average, is beginning to decline in forest cover again. And this is a very different kind of deforestation. The first one that happened was clearing for agriculture. Well, those forests, all you have to do is not mow or hay for a couple of years, and you'll end up with a forest pretty quickly, as probably most of you know in your backyards. But this time around, what we're doing is we're paving over it. We're building houses, we're building roads, we're building, we don't build a lot of shopping malls anymore, but things like that with lots of pavement, transportation corridors, energy transmission lines, those sorts of things. And this is not a situation where the forest tends to grow back if you walk away from it. Similarly, or worse even, is the agricultural situation. So going back to 1930 here, this is how much productive agricultural land there was in 1930 in New England, and here's where we are today. In Connecticut, you probably can't make out, but it's one of the blue lines somewhere around here, I think we're in the low tens of thousands of acres of farmland in Connecticut today. And so what this story is about is the disappearing forests and farmland. And the red areas on this map are showing where the development threats, where the primary land use conversion threats are throughout the New England region. Red are places where more development is likely to happen as populations continue to grow, as people continue to, new generations come along and want to build more homes. And even though predominantly we have a bit of an urbanization paradigm happening, that is, people tend to want to live in cities more, overall we are still losing land cover rapidly. So across New England, we're losing 24,000 acres of forest every year across all of New England. In Connecticut, that's 3,700 acres that's going poof every year from conversion to development of various types. Now, over the next 50 years, that will amount to an area twice the size of the state of Rhode Island if that trend is not reversed or curbed in some way. So every individual development or house lot that gets converted in itself is not a big deal. We all need places to live, and we all understand that. But collectively, when you add them up across the landscape, it amounts to some pretty significant areas. And so it really calls for very thoughtful, planned development, because of course this vision is not an anti-development. It's all about being smart about where we do want the development in our communities. So here's the status of land that is formally protected from development across New England. There's about 10 million acres of forest that is protected. That's about 26% of the forest, and about 12% of the farmland across New England is now protected from development in some sort of permanent status. You'll see that the blue areas are privately owned land, often land trusts that hold easements on other people's lands, or sometimes they own it themselves, but it's privately owned. The red are public areas where local, state, or federal agencies own and manage the land. And you'll notice the trend of all the big blue blocks in the very northern part of our region. Those are what are formerly paper company, big timber companies who own a lot of land and have these large conservation working easements, working forest easements on them. So these are places that are open for recreation, but they're also actively managed for timber and many other benefits. And of course, it's hard to see much of what's going on in our neck of the woods, but don't worry, we'll get there. So this is really the core of the Wildlands and Woodlands vision right now. The start of the vision back in 2010, this is about where we were in land use, where water, developed land use, farmland, forest that is unprotected, forest that was protected, and then these are wildlands. The difference between woodlands and wildlands is wildlands are think of wilderness, think of preserves, places that we're never going to manage for timber products. We're not even going to manage for wildlife habitat for the most of the time. We're just going to leave them alone and stay out and let nature take its course. And this vision calls for a minimum of 10% of the landscape in that forever wild wilderness kind of condition. But it calls for another, sorry, these numbers are confusing. Total, we're talking about 70% of forest. Within that, we're talking 10% of it as wilderness. The other 63% of the landscape should be in permanently protected woodlands. These are forests, much like the forests around us, but which we might manage, and some landowners choose to manage their land for timber products or for water quality or for certain kinds of wildlife habitat, game species or otherwise, or other kinds of recreational and market economic uses. So together we're talking about permanently conserving 70% of New England's landscape. Right now we have 88% of the entire region is in forest. So this vision already assumes we are going to continue to develop more of the land because, again, this is not an anti-development vision. This is a vision about minimizing the impact when we do build housing and commercial development. And, you know, this is a grand idea for a very large area, and of course there's no one group of people or organizations working. And so this is really all about scaling up the local and community and multi-community activities that different people are involved in. So the Guilford Conservation Commission, in working with the town, and the Guilford Land Conservation Trust together are protecting big parts of our town, increasingly so over time. And when lots of towns do that, that scales up across the landscape and will eventually get us to that vision. And so here's just a smattering of some of the interesting initiatives that have happened across New England in the last few decades. Everything from working forest conservation areas to a new national monument in Maine next to Baxter State Park, and lots of much smaller but just as important places within communities largely across southern New England where the land ownership pattern tends to be a little more fragmented than these really large hinterlands of northern New England. One of the great challenges to this vision, probably the biggest challenge to this vision, is simply the lack of money to do this. Preserving land, as you all know, costs a lot of money, whether it's the town deciding to spend tax revenue to buy land, or whether it's the land trust working with private landowners and private donors to fundraise to buy land. It costs a lot of money. The issue here is that over the last little over a decade, public funding across New England for land conservation has declined by about half. So this is state and federal funding that is going to conservation of open space and working lands and farmland and forest land has declined by about half since 2008. Now, this graph does not include individual local funding, which we have just a little bit of information on. But this is, this is a big issue. And you'll see that the biggest decline was actually in the state program funding. And this varies by state, and we can talk more about that later if you're interested. We also have this green line at the bottom, which is private foundation money being invested in conservation initiatives along New England. And what we see there is following the stock market decline in 2008, endowments dropped significantly, therefore giving of foundations dropped significantly. And it has increased somewhat as these foundations' endowments have recovered, but the amount that they're giving to conservation has never quite recovered, even though the value of their portfolios has recovered. And that is one signal to us that conservation and all the benefits we're going to talk about are not rising to a high enough level in our minds for these foundations who previously were giving even more. One issue in Connecticut you'll notice here is that on a per capita basis, so the total amount of money spent on a per person basis in Connecticut is really quite low compared to our peers in New England. You'll see the blue bar is the federal money being spent per capita. It's less than $2 a person. And the red bar is the state money being spent per person on average, just a little over $2. So that's it. That's our public investment at the state and federal level in conserving all these environmental benefits. So we can talk more about that later as well if you're interested. One quick example, Massachusetts does really, really well. It does the best in the region. And one of the reasons it does is they have this thing called the Massachusetts Community Preservation Act, where there is statewide legislation several years ago that allowed towns to choose to opt in or opt out to voluntarily increase their property taxes up to 3% increase, and the state would then match that amount of money. Now, nobody likes to increase their property taxes, but more than half of the towns in Massachusetts have voluntarily done this, and this has now raised $1.75 billion since 2002. So you can see what happens when you start scaling up these small individual local policies. There has been a proposal before the Connecticut legislature on and off for the last few years that some organizations have been working really diligently on. And it's a little bit of a different mechanism. It's about a real estate transfer tax that has been proposed here in Connecticut. And there's been a lot of opposition from the real estate community, as I understand it. But nevertheless, you can see the power of what happens when these things do get enacted. So let's go back to philanthropy for a minute. So in the US, there's about $430 billion a year being given away by individuals and private foundations. Only 3% of it is in this big category called environment and animals. And most of that is animal welfare, domestic animal kinds of activities. It's not wildlife or conservation kinds of activities. So the issue there is that there is just a very small amount of money of the philanthropy in this country getting devoted to the kinds of things we're here talking about tonight. So this emerging field of conservation finance is all trying to understand how are the environmental, social, and economic benefits that come from conservation, how are they all connected to each other? And when we invest in conserving land, are we really just investing in the environment, or are we actually investing in our communities and our own economic development and many other things? And so that's what I want to shift gears and talk a bit about. Who saw this article in the Times this October maybe or September this fall? And if you read the article, it kept pointing to these things about the sort of quality of life in the landscape around us, and it even had some statistics about, I think it mentioned Westwoods, and it had some statistics about the acreage that's conserved here. And here it says, rolling farmland, foregoing the sprawl and density of some of its neighbors. There's an article all about how little Guilford, Connecticut attracts people from away, from the region, from other parts of Connecticut, to come here for the quality of life that balances economic opportunity and the sort of bucolic life around us. Does anybody else feel that way about living in Guilford? Okay, so here is, so one challenge of the town of Guilford is that it's not shaped correctly for showing on slides. It's a very challenging town to show. So we could turn it sideways, and I debated, should I turn it sideways and have you all do this, or should I split it in two? And I chose the latter, and so this is Guilford Land Conservation Trust map of all the organization, including the town and Guilford Conservation Commission, who have conserved their land or land that is actively managed for conservation values. And so we have a lot of regional water authority land up in the north. We have, well, you probably all recognize many of these parcels. The red one here is the missing piece that the Land Trust fundraised for, which was the so-called missing piece of Westwoods that was just acquired and protected about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And so we have a lot of land. There's, depending upon what you count, there's around 6,000 acres. It's about 20% plus or minus of Guilford that is in some form of protection between water company and town-owned land. And we have some really big ones, right? We're really fortunate to have Timberlands and the East River Preserve and of course Westwoods. And we're fortunate compared to some towns to have a few really big ones and then lots of relatively small ones, many of which connect. Not every town has done such a good job of aggregating their conserved lands over time. So I want you to think more about these social, environmental, and economic benefits. You don't need to read all the ones on this slide, but there's a few sort of groupings here. that we're gonna talk through a few of these. Every one of these things has a real tangible dollar amount, or at least a theoretical dollar amount, that these benefits are contributing to society, whether it's offsetting carbon for climate change, or health benefits, or because our water is cleaner because the forest is protected above where you get your water, protecting aquifers. And so we can think about what is the benefit, what is the economic benefit to our community from having many of these things. Here's a map of New England, and this is all the carbon that is being stored by the forest. This is the above ground carbon. We know that half or more of the carbon is actually below ground in the soil, in the roots, and other components of the soil. But this is the above ground carbon. You can see we have a considerable store of carbon here in the region, and we have an ethical duty to maintain and manage that carbon for climate change and other reasons. And we know that older trees, bigger older trees, not only store more carbon just because they're bigger and the carbon is stored in the body of the tree, the bole of the tree, but we know that they actually sequester more carbon from a rate perspective. They are large and they are producing a lot of extra wood. So even as they get into their older years, they're sequestering and storing a lot of carbon. And so as we think about conserving our lands, both for timber products in some places, but also for old growth and wilderness kinds of principles, we're storing carbon in all of those forests. The Nature Conservancy and some of their colleagues produced a globally important study a couple of years ago that's all about natural climate solutions. And what they found is that there's certain ways in which you manage your forests that are really important and low-cost ways to sequester more carbon as part of the climate solution. Alternative energy, of course, is critical, and many other things are going to be really critical. But we can't leave out our forests, and indeed we can rely on our forests to help sequester some of that carbon. Avoided forest conversion, this sort of archaically named category right here, is one of the biggest, but also the least expensive ways to sequester carbon from a global carbon cycle perspective. And what that means is essentially don't let forests that we already have get converted to other land uses. So essentially it's protecting land. So there's a little more to it than that, certainly, but that's what you can think of when you're conserving forests that otherwise might get converted to pavement or other kinds of land uses. You are contributing to this so-called avoided forest conversion, which is globally one of the most important ways to mitigate climate change. In places where there are strong timber economies and forest products industries, they are also sequestering carbon. Now, younger trees are not storing as much, but as you harvest forest products, if you're doing it in a sustainable and sort of well-stewarded way, you are storing carbon in building products. And so the extent that we can replace concrete and steel in our buildings with wood products that are storing carbon that was grown on the stump and now stored in the building, this is another effective way to sequester carbon while also continuing to support our economic industries of various sorts. Our colleagues at the New England Forestry Foundation and some of my colleagues at Highstead had an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of months ago that's all about this and trying to explain why we need to have building codes that allow for bigger wooden buildings. Currently, there are a lot of stringent building codes that don't allow it, particularly in cities, but that's beginning to change as people under the building industry understands the carbon opportunity there. All right, how about air quality? Who breathes easy when they're home in Guilford compared to when they're visiting New York or Boston or somewhere else? You ever notice that? We lived in New Haven for a couple of years before we moved here, and while we loved it there too, it was very quickly apparent to us just the breathing, just the easy breathing we now take for granted. So this has value to us, to society. Something on the order of $550 million a year are the respiratory health benefits associated with the air purification that trees are providing in the Northeast. It's removing 760,000 tons of pollutants. And I know these are just like really big numbers. What does that actually mean? The important point is that small little differences of purifying the air because of the trees around us, both urban trees, but also trees in more rural areas, are indeed having tangible economic benefits for society, often which are not well represented or appreciated. Let's talk about another kind of health. So when I was at the Yale School of Forestry, I teamed up with a group at Yale School of Medicine who was studying community health and had surveyed people in this region, with this 13 towns, I guess it is, including Guilford, New Haven, et cetera, and was asking people about heart-related conditions that they've been diagnosed with, and whether they had, and a whole bunch of other questions, but also whether they had access to parks and open space and trails and urban parks, rural parks, all kinds of things like that. And what we found is that people who have ready access, they themselves understand that they have ready access to these kinds of open spaces, have lower rates of certain chronic diseases. So hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, and surprisingly not quite statistically obesity, but headed in that direction. And so they have pretty significantly lower rates of these diseases. So we did an economic analysis and looked and said, well, that means people are spending less time in hospitals and doctors and using fewer medicines and things like that. So what does that work? What are we not spending on healthcare? Because some people have better heart-related health conditions. And so when we worked with US Census data and Center for Disease Control data and understood the cost of each of these different diseases, what we found is that in this region, across the urban to rural gradient, that's worth something on the order of $37 million a year in healthcare that we are not spending. Now that's us in our pockets, that's our insurance companies, that's our employers, that's all the people that are otherwise bearing the cost of healthcare expenses. So as healthcare expenses are rising so rapidly, as we all know, we should be looking to the world around us for relatively inexpensive opportunities to do that. And I want to emphasize this relationship was true in the urban areas and in the rural areas, and across sociodemographic variation. All right, recreation economy. How many of you once a week or more spend some time on trails near you, whether it's right in town here or up in the north? Most people in the room. So we don't really think of, we just go walk our dog in the woods, or we go for a hike on Bluffhead. We don't really think of that we're part of the recreation economy, but every once in a while you buy some new hiking boots, and maybe you're getting to the point where you like to use some hiking poles, or maybe you bought a new rain jacket. So we're all part of the recreation economy, and this is huge. If you look across the region, you see some very large numbers for what that's worth. But let's focus in on Connecticut for a minute. $9 billion a year in consumer spending from the recreation, and that's related to the tourism industry. 69,000 jobs, and state and local tax revenue, $743 million a year in the state of Connecticut that is coming in because of tourism and local activity related to recreation. So this is everything from small ski areas to beaches to the local gear stores, on up through the whole economy that relies on those businesses. And so when we think within the community, what parts of the community are people using that allow them to spend that money? If we didn't have so many open spaces or beaches, we probably wouldn't need new hiking boots every so often. We wouldn't need new raincoats or hiking poles or sleeping bags or whatever. And so the recreation economy is really built on the backs of the land that you and others are helping to protect in our communities and those faraway places we might go once or twice a year on road trips. So this map is, there's an app called Strava, which a lot of runners and cyclists and cross-country skiers use, and you can either use it just on your phone, or if you have a GPS watch, you can use it. And what it does is it essentially, as you go for a walk or a jog or a bike ride, it tracks where you're going, and it allows you to virtually compete against your friends, or strangers even for that matter, at different times. So if Laura and I go walking on the same trail, and for some reason we cared how fast we did it, I'm not sure we would, but we could see how how quickly someone else did it if we were so inclined. So anyway, that's not the important part. The important part is that it's crowdsourcing data on where people go in our community. Now, anyone that's hiking or running that's using this app, their data are showing up. So if you can imagine taking out the roads, you probably recognize a lot of the darkest lines as the roads. But if you imagine erasing those for a minute and focusing on the places between the roads, those are all the trails, most of which are on protected open space that people are using in our community. And so, we see a lot of Westwoods. I'm going to zoom in on Bittner and Baldwin for a minute. And this is an interesting one because this is a real neighborhood park, right? Look at all the houses, all these perforations, all these neighborhoods right around it. And these are very heavily used trails for dog walking, I've cross-country skied there when we're lucky enough to have good snow, biking, you know, there's the skate park is right next to it, the ball fields. Like, this is a very important community asset that's right there. And this is one of those places that has been protected by the town in this case, and provides these health benefits that we were just talking about. All right, so let's talk about clean water for a minute. So I'm going to tell you a bit about a project that I work on in Maine. How many of you know the Sebago region, Sebago Lake? Oh, a lot of people, that's great. How many people went to camp in the Sebago region? This is a very common phenomenon. I already talked to one person tonight. Okay, great. So what's interesting about the Sebago Lake watershed is that Portland, Maine, which is about a fifth of all Mainers, live in this community, Portland plus several other towns. They get all their drinking water from the Sebago watershed, which is north and west of Portland. And the forest, and the water is so clean because of it's so heavily forested and the lake is so deep that the EPA says they don't have to filter their water. So many of you probably heard about New York City has famously delicious water. They attribute it to the Catskills and the watersheds where the water comes from, and they don't have to filter their water. There's only about 50 of these water utilities in the country that have this waiver from the EPA that they don't have to filter their water. So this is one of them. Now this one is really healthy and in really great shape, and it's 86% forested, and it's pretty rural, but it's beginning to really feel development pressures from the south and moving north and west little by little, emanating as suburban sprawl happens from the great new mecca of Portland, Maine. And so what we've been doing with a group of partners, including land trusts, including local governments, including Portland Water District, which is the water utility, and some local businesses, including several breweries, we've been developing this water fund concept where businesses and individuals from the Portland region who are getting their water really, really cheap down in Portland are able to help the communities upstream to actually protect their forests, to help ensure that Portland Water District never has to build a filtration plant. So we've done the economics on that, and they would spend about $150 to $200 million to have to build a filtration plant, which they don't have to build now because it's so heavily forested. And so we've been going in and talking to businesses and explaining to them, here's what your water bill is today, here's what it might be if Portland Water has to build a filtration plant someday. And that really resonates with some businesses, and other businesses say, you know what, we don't spend that much on our water. But there's other reasons they might care, because their employees care about their community. So we're starting to gain some traction there. And what we've done is we've enumerated all these benefits, right? It's not just about drinking water, it's about the clean air, it's about the carbon benefits, it's about the local recreation economy, and in this area, it is about timber jobs. So this collaborative, just in December, before the end of the year, worked together to conserve 1,400 acres of this former family-owned working timberland property. So they acquired it from a private landowner. The land trust owns it, but it's now being managed as a community forest. So it's being overseen by, and the management plan is being written by community members, but it's actually owned by the land trust in trust for the community members. And that's because a lot of the money was able to be raised because of the drinking water and the local recreation benefits associated with that. All right. Now, we often hear, and maybe before my time at Guilford this occurred here too, that doing a lot of conservation costs the town, whether through tax revenues or decreased economic benefits, or if you displace housing opportunities, what about the people that were going to build the houses there? And so we've embarked with some of our collaborators on some new research to try to understand, what's the net economic impact of conservation? Is it true? Is it actually costing our communities a lot, or are there benefits we just haven't understood before? And so the first thing we did is we said, what about jobs? Sometimes you hear in certain communities that they're taking jobs away when you take land off the tax rolls and don't build on them. And so what we did is we teamed up with an economist, Kate Sims at Amherst College in Massachusetts, who's really quite well known internationally for her land use economics work. And we got data on the jobs growth in communities all across New England. and we looked at the rates of land conservation all across New England, and we looked at building permits in towns all across New England. This was 1,500 towns and communities we did across New England. And what we found, surprisingly to many, is that jobs actually increase in towns that conserve more land. And the statistics, the nature of how this study was done, because it's such a big area, it's a very powerful study, statistically speaking, Kate showed that it is a causal effect. Towns that increase the rate of conservation in their towns, in the subsequent 5-year period, have an increase in the number of jobs. Now, it's not lots of jobs. It's a small effect, the percent you can see over here. But here's an example. A town with 20,000 people, if they went from 10% of their town protected to 15% of their town protected, they would get only seems small, 1.5% increase in the number of jobs. But in a town with 20,000 people, that's 300 jobs. And when we went around and have talked to a lot of people in New England around this, people are usually pretty surprised by this and surprised by the magnitude. So, anyway, this is the kind of thing we're interested in understanding more about what the economic implications are, and we're finding some of these surprising stories. Now, the cost of community services idea has been around for quite a while. The idea that land that is conserved doesn't add to the costs in the town because, you don't have a lot of new kids coming in your schools for any given piece of land that's protected. Now, you may not decrease the number of school needs in your town, but you're not adding services in the way that you do when you add a development. You don't need new transmission lines, water and sewer, and I realize here in Guilford we don't do all those things anyway. A lot of us are on wells and septic. So the idea is that land that is conserved costs the town less. So yes, sometimes it comes off the tax rolls, but it's also costing the town less. And so conserved land costs about 30 cents on the dollar of all the tax revenue that it brings in compared to what it costs the town. Whereas residential developments, which are blue here on average, are about $1.10 in costs for every dollar they bring in revenue. Anybody recognize this?
Mm-hmm.
146.
Yeah. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the future. So I've talked a little bit about the past and how conservation land is happening. Some of my colleagues at the Harvard Forest, in particular Jonathan Thompson, has been leading this work for several years where stakeholder groups from every New England state were brought together and asked, groups just like yourselves, were brought together and asked, what do you want to see in your community in the future? Like, what do you envision it looking like? Do you envision transit-oriented development, which is one of these smart growth ideas, cluster developments? Where do you prefer to live? In town? Do you prefer to buy large lots out in the forest? And asked all these land use kinds of questions of professionals and citizens, and it led to this Future Scenarios project. So these maps that are animating on their own here are showing, starting in 2000, we'll recycle here in a second, starting in 2010 and going to 2060, it's showing you the range of possible land use changes that could occur based on the middle one is current trends. So if we kept building and conserving at roughly the same rates that we do today, this is one possible outcome of what we would end up with in 2060. And then these other scenarios, community connectedness is a very smart growth-oriented series of policies. Yankee Cosmopolitan is very transit-oriented development. Growing global is basically a free-for-all where globalization drives all of our local land use decisions. And you can see when we get back to 2060 just how red the whole Boston to New York region gets. So, we're not predicting any one of these, but we're saying these are the ranges, these are the scenarios of what could occur if we choose certain kinds of land use or conservation policies or not. This, by the way, is available in mapping form. So if you want to zoom into Guilford and play around and look at your neighborhood about how these scenarios play out, you can go to that website there and do that, knowingthelandscapes.org. I'm going to zoom in, though, on Guilford for a couple of minutes and just show you. So here we are. This is today. This is what the land use looks like today. Red are places that are developed. Yellow is farmland. It may not be productive farmland, but it is, fields of various sorts. Light green is forest land, and dark green is land that is protected. Okay, so that's what it looks like today. Here's what the trend, that's if we did the same things we've been doing for the last 30 years, if we keep doing them, this is what our community is likely to look like in 2060 based on the current trends. Okay, pretty significant growth. This is based on real life growth rates of population, town influxes, things like that. Here's what the growing global, the sort of free-for-all scenario might look like in the year 2060. Now again, these aren't predictions, these are a range of possible outcomes if different policies are adopted. This does not include any sea level rise. The Nature Conservancy has a really wonderful coastal mapper you can use if you want to see that. This does reflect expected in-migration to New England because of climate change. This assumes people move inland a little bit, but it also assumes they move from places like Arizona and desert regions to the Northeast because we will probably be wetter, not drier, even if we'll be warmer in this region. All right, so I've thrown a lot of information at you. I'm just about done. But I want to say we have a lot of material. So if there's a particular figure that was compelling to you or a statistic you didn't quite catch, we have a lot of resources. Many of them are in the table here. They're all available on our websites, which I'll show you in a minute. First is the series of these wildlands and woodlands reports starting in 2005, 2010, 2017 that really lay out this vision and have a lot of background science and finance stuff behind this. For those of you that do conservation work professionally, we have a lot of technical stuff, a lot of white paper reports and things. But we also have this series of briefs, and there are paper copies on the table up front, that are really aimed at communities who are thinking through some of these issues and are thinking about how do we convince our neighbors, how do we convince our town leadership that further investments in conservation are a good idea and are not a detractor. So whether it's water quality you're trying to conserve or protect, or whether it's the recreation economy or some of the local tax implications, we have some resources available there. And I want to leave you with a few things. I know many of you are already deeply engaged in this work and indeed responsible for helping create the great community that we have here in Guilford. But get involved in your local conservation commission, Guilford Conservation Commission, or your land trust, Guilford Land Conservation Trust. And get involved, and there's invasive species work to do, there's trail maintenance work to do, there's working on management plans for some of the properties. I know there's a few folks here who are really interested in that. There's groups that are looking to acquire land, and if you have real estate expertise or you have fundraising expertise, there's so much help that is really needed. I know both groups are always looking for additional talents to join. There's also a lot of state policies that occur that, that affect our conservation, whether it's funding for conservation or whether it's policies about setting state goals for how much land should be protected in the state. There's both local and regional initiatives around smart growth, whether that's cluster developments or whether that's going to a hearing to voice your concern or your support for how a particular development is going to occur in our town. Or in another community maybe you're part of. And recognize that we're part of this strong rural and exurban community that we rely on some of the bigger towns like New Haven and the city centers around us, but nevertheless we're in this strong rural economy and we still have farmland in our community that's cherished, has been for centuries here in town, and so recognize we're part of that. And overall, strong support for increased public funding is really what will lead to this vision becoming a reality, because it means more money available for all those of you that are involved in land protection to utilize. And if you're of the means or you're so inclined, you yourself can donate and get involved in conservation through helping to acquire land, helping to build trails, helping to fund education programs. This is Hans Weiss, who has been very generous. About a year ago, announced he was going to donate $1 billion because of all the environmental concerns that he has seen, largely related to climate change, but a lot more than that. That gets conservation organizations pretty excited when numbers like that show up. And I guess just the last thing I'll leave you with is that when was it, September, we were very fortunate to have some of our state leadership, local and state leadership come to Westwoods. Our representatives and Senator Elizabeth Cohen and representatives here came and walked with us at Westwoods and talked to some of the constituents and really just had a great conversation about how important places like that are to our community. So we're fortunate to have really strong support from our leadership. And of course, there's always more we can do. This is how you can find me over here, and I will stay as long as you folks have questions or concerns, or just want to tell us about some of the places you're most excited about here in town.
So if someone could turn up the lights, perhaps? And I'll let you manage this, but anyone has any questions, this is our time.
Yes?
Renewable energy, you didn't mention it.
Didn't? No. What about it?
Does it fit into the scheme? Now, we talk about farmlands, a lot of farmlands are being converted to solar.
Yep.
And in Europe, a lot of farmlands are used for wind turbines.
Yes.
Is this in the scheme?
It fits really well on my roof, I can tell you that. It fit nicely. I had to take down a few trees, but once I did that, it fit on my roof. And that was great.
But did you use the wood in another place on the property?
I used part of it to build a tree house, and part of it I'm burning to heat my house. Yes. And we charge one of our cars from the solar. So yes, of course. The question is commercial scale or residential scale. And we have seen a lot in Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island in particular, a lot of places where state policies around solar siting are advantageous for solar developers to either use fields, you can imagine why that's pretty easy to do, or it's even economical for them to clear a forest and put down solar panels. And so I guess from a forester's and an ecologist perspective, I would be pretty concerned about that proliferating, and that is happening in a lot of places. So I think the incentive systems that are encouraging solar to happen in places that maybe have better benefits from ecological or sort of forest carbon sequestration perspective, I would say that's problematic. But we, of course, need lots of solar panels, and so thinking about siting and whether the incentives are structured to encourage them in existing commercial areas or brownfields or places that don't have some of those other benefits. Yes, sir.
What's the state funding for farmland preservation and forest restoration?
Yeah, so the legislature did just pass another open space bond, Community Open Space Act money recently, and so I've forgotten the exact amount. Someone here might be able to refresh my memory. So that is available. If we went back to one of the earlier slides, I showed the trends, the overall trends. It is decreasing over time. It is not as high a priority as our state has a lot of fiscal challenges. Maybe we're lucky that much get funded. But overall, over time, that amount of money is getting degraded. So Guilford has done very well. I only know about the land trust in particular, but has done very well getting significant state funding for our projects. And there was a sizable contribution from the state for the missing piece in Westwoods last year. So we are very fortunate to have that support. But from a big picture perspective, overall, it's different. Yes?
Is there any focus on salt marsh disappearing under high tides? Because we kayak on the coast, we've just been in Guilford for 20 years, and we've seen just incredible change in water level. And we know that carbon is released.
Could you repeat the question, Spencer? It didn't come up.
Yes. The question is about how much of a focus is there on salt marshes and the degradation of salt marshes over time. And you were saying that you've been here for 20 years, and in that time you've seen a loss of salt marsh.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the salt marsh will release carbon because the root system becomes very loose.
Yes.
And then
Yes. So she's also explaining how there are climate change problems associated with that as you lose salt marsh, and the cordgrass dies and the root systems get loosened up over time, there's carbon leakage. So absolutely, we are in a time, and will continue to be in a time, where sea level rise is affecting our landscape. Now, a lot of our salt marshes in Guilford and along the coastline were protected a long time ago. And so I would say in many ways we're fortunate we have as much left as we do have. Now, we could talk, or some of you that were involved in this long before I was here, maybe could say why we protected some of those lands. Often it was because people couldn't build in them or didn't really want to build in them, and what else are you going to do with it? And so in some cases, it was sort of fortuitous that some were protected. But sea level rise is a lot worse in places that don't have the salt marshes, because the salt marshes absorb a lot of the energy from big storms. And as we know, we're going to have more frequent, bigger storms and less sort of more heterogeneity over time in storm surges. And so those help actually absorb some of that. So yes, it will continue to get worse. It could be even worse. We could be in a community that had already built and filled in all of our salt marshes. So maybe that's a good news, bad news story.
Spencer, I always wonder how coordinated the efforts are between the Yale School of Forestry, Harvard, the Nature Conservancy. Are you guys always talking to each other so that you get the maximum science out of the available resources?
I would say what you just described is what I spend a good chunk of my week doing, yes. Not everyone is always in touch, but one thing I didn't say is that we're only 9 people at the HISA Foundation. We're a very small outfit, but we have this sort of niche that we hold very dear, and that is we try to be connective tissue between lots of other organizations doing work. So sometimes we're advocating on behalf of partnerships, sometimes we're starting new partnerships, sometimes we're trying to provide some science, sometimes we're trying to provide communications help, but we are always drawing on all those resources and others. So, I have an appointment at the Harvard Forest. I spend a lot of time there. I also collaborate closely with folks in the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale. I spent some time working there. So I would say on average the conservation community is doing that quite a bit, and I would say that in particular is a big focus of ours. Doug?
I'm sorry, a question that's sort of tangential to a lot of what you're talking about, but when you talk about the history of land use in New England, you're looking at basically once the European contact started happening. And I wonder what research has been done about land use practices before Europeans began to colonize New England, and if there's any learnings that we can take in our time from previous indigenous land use practices.
So that is a very fascinating field that I will get over my skis pretty quickly on, so I'll try to point you in the right direction,
Okay,
but
yes.
I won't pretend to be an expert in it. So there is a lot of research on that. There's a lot of work on understanding what the history was. For a long time, it was thought that the landscape was, the landscape was heavily influenced by Native Americans, but there was an understanding that there was a lot more of an influence, particularly around burning and fires, accidental and on purpose, for agriculture, particularly in the river system areas where they tended to spend a lot of time. Just a couple weeks ago, a new paper came out in one of the nature journals that actually, one of the co-authors is one of my close colleagues, David Foster, that actually shows through charcoal records and land use records that that's probably much less true than we used to think. There's been this academic sort of debate for a long time about that. So there even now is new research coming out that we're learning more about those dynamics. But if you want to dig into that, I can point you a few resources. We, of course, we are living in an area where we know there was a very strong Native American population here. And I have friends that roam the woods and find arrowheads and other artifacts and things like that. So, I have a small little contest I was going to offer. And I can think of 2 people in this room that I'm pretty sure know the answer to this. And if you feel like you're a ringer, maybe you should let someone else who's not a ringer answer this question. So I'll just put it there. But so for anyone that can answer this, or for the first person that can answer this question, this trivia, I will donate to you and your family an annual family membership to the Guilford Land Conservation Trust. If you're already a member, I'll pay for your next year's membership to the Guilford Land Conservation Trust. Okay, so the question is, what are selectmen stones, and can you tell me where they are in Guilford? I know of at least 3, I think there are more, but there are not many more. Does anybody know what selectmen stones are, or where you can find selectmen stones? That hand went up first.
Well, they're over on the Guilford-Branford town line off of Red Hill Road,
Yep,
and there are about 30 there.
yeah, and what are they? Why
They are, it comes from English pattern back in the 1600s, where the people who were heads of the town would walk the boundary, and mostly for tax purposes, so they catch what farmer was on what side of what line, make sure they pay tax to the right. That came over to Guilford,
Yeah,
and
that's
it's sort of been started up again.
Yeah, so that one is on, I think it's the White Trail between sort of some
Yeah.
Branford Land Trust trails and then the Green Trail that heads over towards Westwoods on the Guilford Land Trust side. That's right. Okay, you win. Can anybody else tell me where some others are? I can think of 2 other locations in town.
Across from Bluffhead, there's another hiking trail, at Braemar.
Yeah,
You go
Braemar.
up there and you'll see a lot of them in
Okay.
the section, because I think Madison and Guilford may have.
In Durham, so on Micah Ledges, there's some on Micah Ledges where the 3
Yeah.
towns come together.
Yeah.
Yep.
What do they look like?
Well, they look like different things. So the one on Micah Ledges is like, sort of like a pile of rocks. It's essentially a cairn, a pile of rocks, and some of the rocks are engraved with initials and years on them.
Oh.
The ones on Red Hill, do you want to describe what the arrangement looks
Yeah,
like
they're
on Red Hill?
mostly cobble, I mean, they're cobbles, they're not granite, they're rolled, and they've been carved, the dates are in there, 18 something, some of them are hard to read because of the moss. A Eagle Scout put together a little project and set them in poured concrete in a little frame, and there's a plaque up there. Should go up and have a look.
You actually describe what the selectmen did, when they went to these spots, and what did they actually do?
They walked the edge of the town.
Yep.
The selectmen from Ross and whoever was in Guilford at the time, they walked along the boundary.
It's like if you and your neighbor.
Did they throw a stone down?
Yeah, it'd be like a mark. So if you and your neighbor were like, nobody had ever surveyed your property, you didn't have rebar or a little plastic cap on it, you and your neighbor once a year might go walk the property and just remind each other where it is. And, say, hey, your brush pile's on my property now. And you just sort of, you're rechecking the boundary. And yeah, so they're essentially monuments, the corners. Anyone know of any others? There's one at the very northwest of Northwoods, Redwood. What is the actual property in Northwoods at the very northwest corner? Yeah,
James Valley.
yeah, James Valley. There's one there too.
We have seen that.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so I'll check in with you afterwards. Are you a member of the land trust yet?
Not Guilford.
Okay. All right. Which land trust? Branford?
Branford.
Branford. So should we go walk that line together?
And
right through the line,
Great.
that'd be a good picture.
It would be, yeah. That's beautiful.
I'd go.
All right, so any other questions? Yes?
If we were to plant trees around here ourselves on property, what are the best trees for carbon and sequestration?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So there are variations between trees and how much carbon they sequester. But I think there's probably other things to factor in before you decide which one optimizes carbon. I mean, I think, first of all, I would say native trees. I would say pick your favorite tree that belongs here and plant that. Don't plant, Japanese maple, or don't, Norway maple, even worse, because they'll spread all over your yard. Plant something that belongs here, nice sugar maple or hickory or any one of the oaks, white oaks I'm particularly fond of myself. So I would pick your favorite native tree that is going to work well on the spot you want. Do you want a big shade tree? Do you want a more conical shaped tree? Do you want a tree that's going to keep its roots, tap roots like oaks, really deep down and not have to worry about shallow roots that are going to mess up your septic system or your lawn?
Or come down in a storm?
Or come down in a storm, and you want a long-lived tree.
Fast growing also might be something.
Sure, I mean, if you were trying to build a hedgerow, you'd want to pick trees that were going to turn into a hedgerow quicker. If you wanted a monument tree, particular occasion, you might do something a little different. So there are variations in how much carbon they will sequester, but that probably wouldn't be the first criteria.
Maybe not an ash tree at this particular time.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not an ash tree or a hemlock tree. I'm a bit of a woodworker, and I have a couple hundred board feet of white ash in my basement drying, waiting to be made into some things from trees that suffered. The emerald ash board had to come down, so I don't mind it from that perspective.
Hemlock branches only from midpoint up.
Yeah, and the hemlock woolly delegate, you probably all know, really decimated Westwoods. This was a particularly heavily hit part of the state, and Westwoods is a totally different place, as I understand it, than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So another hand. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that you advocate the use of wood materials for building homes, but at the same time, to build a home out of wood means that you're going to have to harvest and
Sure.
decrease the woodlands. Can you just say a little more about the pros and cons of that?
Yeah. Well,
Where do you benefit?
right. I mean, if you want to get really scientific about it, it's a very complicated calculus. There's a whole field called life cycle analysis about this, but let's assume we don't want to go there. You're going to build a house. You've already decided you're going to build a house. You've already decided where it's going to go. You have to decide what you're going to build it out of. And you could use, I don't know how many people use steel studs in their house, probably not many, it's mostly a commercial application. But that decision alone would have pretty big impacts on the carbon footprint of the house. You know, then there are lots of trade-offs about what kinds of materials go in there, and there are other, like, you have to start trading off not just the carbon components of it, but what kinds of chemicals went into building the things. So it gets messy quickly, but overall, our friends at New England Forestry Foundation have done some really good work to talk about if we converted X number of buildings, you know, from a big picture, from a broad scale, how much carbon we could store in those buildings and displace the concrete and steel, which are very, very carbon intensive.
But did they also calculate into their formula decrease in the forest
Yes.
to build those houses?
Yes.
And they still came out with a net positive?
Yes, the big caveat to that is you have to have certain very high quality forestry standards. So there's like any kind of management system, there's some pretty lousy forestry and there's some really high quality forestry. And if you're building more wood buildings, but you're doing it in a very unsustainable way, you're cutting more trees than you're growing in any given year, that's not a good recipe. But if you assume a certain level, and they actually have a whole thing they call exemplary forestry standards for the exact purpose you mentioned.
How do we make the existing housing stock more attractive to the buyer? Because it always makes me itch when I see somebody clearing another acre when there's 4 houses for sale.
Yeah.
What can we do to?
You could come redo my kitchen for me. That would
You wouldn't want me to redo your kitchen.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I mean, that is a really interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of design trends and what people think are interesting and new are always changing, right? And people often want to kind of customize and build something. So I don't really know the answer to that. If I were a builder, I might understand that more. I do not know the answer to that. I'm sure there could be incentive policies to make it harder to develop new land, but easier to redevelop existing houses. That's a question for probably real estate. But that's a good question. Yes?
So, back to the wood and the buildings. And again, predominantly commercial buildings with the steel and the glass.
Yeah.
What do you do about fire? I mean, that's why, you know,
Yep.
everything, for instance, in New York is about fire.
Sure.
All
So,
over.
so that is the key sticking point of why building codes have not switched over yet to allowing wooden buildings. I think the community that's really active in this, their target range is around 8 stories. They think the biggest impact can be done in buildings that are in the 8-story range because they can be economically built at that size. And a lot of the benefits accrue to buildings that size, whereas it gets much more complicated as you get a lot bigger than that. And a lot of the proposals are to build these out of what's called cross-laminated timber, which is kind of like, you know how plywood is really thin sheets of wood that are stacked like this, and it gets stronger by doing that. It's essentially that, but thicker wood. I mean, it's not, but it's essentially creating bigger timbers, beams, from much smaller pieces of wood. So you can use lower grade material from the forest that might not have to grow as long to build these bigger, very strong beams. And then there's a treating process that does the fireproofing part of it. And so a lot of the work is, as I understand it, and I'm not directly involved in this, but is about trying to make the building code, the people that are responsible for building codes, understand that process and why the fire risk is not as high as we might otherwise assume.
Right, so what about the process though of making it fireproof?
Yeah.
Chemicals and that part of it?
Yep. I don't really have any of those details, but the New England Forest Foundation does have some of those. They actually have a pamphlet that's all about that topic. So if you want, you can talk to me afterwards. Yeah. Other questions or shared stories you want to share about your favorite places?
I just wanted to share a couple things. One was a couple of years ago, we were visited Plymouth, Mass, and the Colonial Village there. And there's a Indian dwelling with, at the time, a couple of descendants who were the docents of whatever they're doing their daily sort of routine. And we were inside and talking with an older descendant of the tribe in that area, and just chatting, and she says, well, you know, the trees give us everything. And I don't know about you, but for me that was such a resonating truth when you think about it. It's just so, it's a whole lot deeper for a simple statement than it sounds. The other thing I wanted to mention was I just, by coincidence, happened to pick up this book, which is popular, maybe some of you have already read, it's on the bestseller list, called The Hidden Life of Trees. And, okay, so it's good?
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's
Yep.
really good.
Hurry up and return it so other people can check it out.
Actually, this came from another library, but that's
Okay. Great.
our loan system.
All right, well, I appreciate your attention and all your really good questions.